Why is there no love in the hearts of man? The defining question of Vinland Saga, an anti-war war anime which explores the devastation not just of war itself, but a culture centered around it. One where even a kind prince is considered a disgrace. Canute is a holder of one of the most unique perspectives in the anime that allows him to go through anime's greatest transformation and emerge on the other side as a true king, rather than just a meek prince. His story is an interconnected web that includes some of the most multi-purpose development I've ever seen, and I'm excited to get into why it's so great and why he's so great right now. True for any story, but even more so for the great ones, before we can attempt to understand Canute, we first have to establish a baseline for the world of Vinland Saga, a fictionalized representation of the turn of the millennium. Calling it harsh would be an understatement. Their average temperatures are freezing or worse, with nothing more than fire and furs to keep themselves warm. We witness the minimal amount small villages are able to eat, rationing through the winter only so they can prepare to do the same once again. War is a near constant state, with peace unknown to entire generations. In fact, the act of dying in combat is celebrated as an entrance to Valhalla through honor, or to heaven through righteousness. Young men wait in their villages for the return of war parties, hoping that their peers have been slayed in combat, so they too can move on to die in war. In this climate, both nature and war, taking from others can be the easier path. Like Askeladd and his men, entire livelihoods are paid for off of the backs of deaths of people they've never known, at least no longer than it takes to bring down an axe. Others are somehow even less lucky than those being taken advantage of, being spared only to be sold into slavery in lands where escape goes by another name: death. Everywhere, the people of this world dream of something better, of Valhalla, or heaven, or Vinland, or the domain of Artorias, all different names for the same thing, an escape from the horrors that they face. The case we see the most in Vinland Saga is the Danish, the heritage of Canute. They're the eternal aggressors, some filling their pockets with money stolen from conquest, while their neighbors' sons die on a battlefield, fulfilling a successful life in their society. Their lives take two stages: waiting to go to war and going to war. Training so you can kill as many others as possible before you yourself are killed. Power is the mark of success. The daughters of kings and nobles are gifted as rewards for slaughters. If someone else questions your power, you fight to the death to see who is right, whether they're an enemy on the battlefield or a friend you were just eating with. While the emphasis is certainly on brute strength, as long as you can exert your will over someone else, you're on the right path, whether through money or over a slave. If you had to place a keyword on it all, destruction would be it. There's no focus on creating something new, but only on destroying what others have. And if you're from somewhere where this isn't the norm, eventually the Danish will come and make it the norm. No one is safe from the harshness of this world. This includes Canute, despite his status as a prince. As Ragnar explains, he adopted his shyness as a defense. Those who stood out or made ambition obvious in his family were killed as threats to gaining the crown's power. Even the bonds of family meant nothing when compared to the ideal of absolute power in this society, and this drove the prince to reclusion. Instead of fighting on the battlefield and then at home to become the next in line, he adopted Christianity. He prayed and learned and cooked. But despite his best efforts, power eventually called his name as well. Serving as a vessel for those who craved it, some sought to install him as the next king over his brother. In response, their father sent him to die at Torkel's hands, a move which raised no eyebrows, showing the extent to which death was expected and celebrated. That he was in charge of defeating this. And then, despite being seen as worthless to the king, the outsiders see him as anything else. To Torkel, he's the value of a greater fight. For Askeladd, the value of a king, and everyone else, the value of, well, value, money, the only thing they understand as having value, seen by the priest's talk with Askeladd's men. Ragnar, his true father, pushed him away from hate, his biological father to it, and everyone in between dragged him in their own directions of power. The best summary for Canute in respect to his Danish blood is the fact that he cooks. This detail wasn't just chosen as a typical example of the work of a woman or slave, but also because it's an act of creation. Death is inevitable, the Danes simply rush towards it, but cooking is the act of taking that unavoidable fact and making something new from it. Where war is a destruction of life simply for destruction's sake, cooking is the acceptance of a destruction of life for the sake of other life. An exact picture of nature which incorporates the traits of an individual, say maybe the spices they use, how long they could cook the meat, and how, which method, and the final presentation that caught their eye, and a lot more we could list. This is an act of personality in creation which opposes everything a Viking is taught to be. In short, Canute is a complete and total failure for them. Now this much is obvious, but where things really get interesting is the fact that he was destined to be a failure from the start. As a younger prince, he was behind the pack in physical strength, so he survived by making himself scarce, even if he was physically at the castle. His options were to become strong and die as a threat, or to be weak and die as his father chose. And his father is a bloated and demented man, unable to teach his son any of the things he wanted him to be. He did nothing to raise his son, but expected perfection anyway. And further, he leaves him in the care of a Christian Norman, someone with values different from the Vikings, but he expects Viking results. And then with his faith, Canute could fight and kill for the sake of it to succeed, but then he wouldn't be a good Christian accepted into heaven, failing in just another way. Every single side kidnaps him for their own benefit, so no matter where he goes, it's the same result of failure. Even at home, he would just be a puppet for others. There is no success for Canute, whatever the situation and decision. Ragnar asks why the prince never gets to choose, but it wouldn't matter anyway. Every path was closed and decided. He was abandoned by his father, and aside from one man, there was no love in his world. If this sounds familiar, it's because these are the facts he builds his changed mentality upon, just with God. What he believes God has done to humanity is the same thing his father had done to him. A father who he sees as having abandoned his children, giving them no path to success but expecting perfection anyway in a world with no love. These values and claims he finds after enlightenment aren't new or random. They're just an acceptance of the world he's seen and felt his entire life. And acceptance is the key word because it isn't a grand revelation. It really is just simple acceptance. He knows these facts from the start, he just never put them into words. Look at when Canute projects his rage at Thorfinn. It's because Thorfinn is the first person who didn't uphold the veil that allowed him to refuse acceptance. Canute was always one step removed from acknowledgement, with words like Your Highness and the false respect he was shown. There was plausible deniability to the thought that he was a failure. But Thorfinn, in his lack of care for anything, doesn't extend those pretenses, calling the prince a loser and openly looking down on him. This child, the one who's constantly beaten and bloody and bruised and obsessed with killing a single man, the exact product of the Viking world just barely surviving, telling Canute that he's a failure. One of the few other people in the world who had experienced something that could be called love, but willfully ignored it anyway, judging the prince for being a failure. While he's unaware of the latter part of that, the former still makes Canute mad enough to speak up for the first time, something which may have led to his death at home, because it's exactly what he knows inside thrown in his face. He's angry at this confirmation, and he throws shitty excuses at the wall mixed in with the truth, like, we're different, and you don't know how hard it is to be from the royal family. His almost recognition shows again as the priest begins to question God, or more aptly, the father. Canute explodes on him, saying he should fear the Lord, that they shouldn't doubt his love because every father loves their child. Even Thorfinn gives this a look of recognition because of its noun-based ambiguity. It's no question there's two fathers here, when he asks for forgiveness and when he says they should fear him and insists that he loves them. Canute's enlightenment is not a grand revelation, it is just acceptance of the things he's always known. What changes isn't the thoughts, but the ability to turn them into words. And Askeladd, maybe recognizing what lies under the surface, correctly performs the cause of this change when he kills Ragnar. Ragnar, like everything, may have just been another path of failure for Canute, but he was hope. And hope is a great thing, right? Everyone in Vinland Saga has hope. Hope that they'll find salvation of some form. It keeps them going through the harsh lives they live. But is this hope that there's something better, just an excuse to do nothing? For all its good, sometimes hope is just a tool for inaction. Even though Canute knew all the things we mentioned, that his father hated him, that he was a discarded failure, he takes no more action than preparing a place for exile. He let the men under his command be slaughtered while he prayed, content that maybe God would provide him a solution that didn't require his choice. He stood and watched as different sides warred both for and against his name time and time again, and finally when a village was slaughtered simply so he could survive. Horrendous things were happening all around him while he did nothing, because he had Ragnar and because he had faith, some of his hope, that was the last layer of removal from the situation. Ragnar kept those who insulted the prince in line, made sure he wouldn't be assaulted, that he had food to eat and water to drink and everything else. He was a shield that protected him, but also kept him back, kept him from changing the situation and making him unfit for the world. But when Ragnar dies, Canute doesn't curse his name for this fact. He doesn't turn and say, "Why did you make me weak and complacent?" He says, "Things would have been better if I was born as your child." The prince was a quiet observer. Rather than speaking and influencing, he witnessed the world around him and internally drew his own conclusions. Now, the priest is right to say that Ragnar's love was tainted, because it did require the destruction of others, the same as anything the Danes touched. But Canute never takes issue with Ragnar's love itself, because that kind of care didn't make him weak or soft, even if it did make him unfit for some of his conditions. Ragnar's love was cruel to the rest of the world, because the world was incapable of love. He lets others be destroyed to love Canute, because they only provide the means for destruction. This society the Vikings crafted, the wars that they waged that forced others to hate as well, there was no capacity for others to do more than hate. Time and time again, Canute watches care, or some version of it, lead to destruction. To love, Ragnar had to deal with the hate of others, whether that was trying to tell his men not to fight, or accepting the slaughter of an entire village. One of the reasons Canute seeks to create a paradise on Earth is because there was no problem with Ragnar's feelings. There was a problem with the world which made them have to be expressed in such awful ways. Canute's observation turns into duty once Ragnar dies. As we said, as one of the few who experienced a form of love, he's one of the few who can try to create a world which has it. Coming from a powerful family, where even a father with more freedom and resource than anyone is still incapable of love, he's fit to cast off the idea of fatherhood which extends into all of their lives. Everyone is someone's son and they're judged on that fact, none so more than him. As someone of faith, he's witness to the toll the belief takes and how little it returns. Seeing his own blood kill each other, being kidnapped over and over, watching beatings and slaughters, he took no action because he was supposed to be holier than such influences. And look where it got him. He's taken the test of faith, but instead he decided that the teacher had failed to make it passable. He watches as everyone he encounters, of his faith and others, have differing versions of heaven which lead to great conflict. The Danes see the English as unfit for Valhalla and hate them, and the English see the Danes as unfit for heaven and hate them back. But if there was a paradise on earth which they could both see, there would be no reason for them to hate each other over it. If they had something to place their hope in that was real, they would no longer stagnate in hope. Such a thing could stop the conflicts and eventually start to bring the capacity for love back into their world. And once people are no longer stuck in stagnation hoping for heaven to find them as he was, they can begin to heal and they can begin to love. There won't be an excuse for death or inaction any longer. His plan isn't just some abstract or emotional reaction. It's a logical one based on what he's seen from his unique perspective. This is why I call it a duty rather than anything else, because as an observer he knows how unique his perspective is, and how few have not just the ideas he does, but the power he does. He had preparations to go into exile, and he admits to Ragnar nobility means nothing to him. This isn't about some desire for power. This is obligation. Look at the priest, for example. This nobody character from nowhere helps him reach enlightenment. Without this man, there is no transformed Canute. Arguably, he's one of the most impactful characters of the series. But when he tries to spread ideals, it leads only to backlash. When he tries to save a village, it nearly gets him killed. If the king of a powerful nation tried, however, there's a backing for success. Up to that often hollow word, another aspect of his situation that screams, "This can only be done by you." Is it fitting as some kind of fate that, after failure as his only option for so long, one glorious path for success seemed to shine through? The logic of his plan doesn't end with just actual paths to creating love, however. After seeing the horrors that he does, he'd be naive to think a simple hug and kind words would solve every conflict he comes across. In a world which lacks the capacity for love entirely, he needs men like Askeladd and Thorfinn. He doesn't like their methods. When Askeladd kills a slave as a double for Canute, the prince tells him not to do it again, but he didn't do anything to stop the first use. He understands why these men have been successful, and he allows them to use those tools for his success. When you look at the over-the-top action of Vinland Saga, one character is completely toned down from his role in it, and that is Canute. Rather than fighting directly and creating intense, gory scenes like Askeladd and Thorkel do, he's often spattered in the blood that comes from his eventual followers' battles, or shown behind their murderous actions. While he may not perform them directly, he says he'll give meaning to those battles and to their lives. The role Canute accepts as a leader, another part of why he appears almost arrogant after his transformation, is because he's placing himself and his goals as their reason for these actions. Since they are men who know only death and destruction, who've never sought a greater purpose of their own, he becomes that purpose in a way they can understand. A king. He was already used as a reason for heinous things, only now it's of his choice, a responsibility he takes, once again cognizant of the way this world works. While placing himself somewhat above others in this way may be overconfidence or arrogance, and probably somewhat is as he looks down on those who don't even try to seek anything greater, there's another reason why he can take on this burden that's much more self-effacing. As he says before preparing to be struck by Thorkel, his life is meaningless anyway. From the start, he's been nothing more than a dead man, whatever path. He only ever got to have a mild input into the method of his destruction. He was literally thrown away. He could not so much as flinch at a death blow from Thorkel because it really is like he's already dead. Fitting, since the priest sees death as the only form of love in their world, so wouldn't someone who seeks it already be a dead man? In a way, you could say this coldness is his way of not repeating the mistakes of the father. Not just God and the king, but also of Ragnar. His goal of returning humanity to paradise where they could once again find love is already a rejection of the former two, but doing so in a realistic way is a rejection of Ragnar. Look at the cost that came before his simple realization. The blood of his brothers and sisters, of the men who fought in his name and those against it. The entire village, Thorkel's men and Askeladd's men alike, his own father, and then Askeladd himself, and of course, Ragnar as well. As they planned exile, or ordered soldiers back into combat, or watched as the townspeople were killed, it was all because their love was incompatible with this world. It was so narrow-reaching and costly because of this. As much as we may hate things, there's no success in forcing a principle or ideal into a world which can't accept it. It needs to be built up and raised, introduced and nurtured as others get to know and support it. It's like a child being raised. Where the fathers before him had failed such a task, Canute tries to succeed. A father to love in the loveless world. His method isn't without cost either, as we know. And now, he's not even entirely detached from it. Askeladd's death is the most subtle in the series in terms of no big flashy show, because this death isn't about honor or glory or Valhalla or any of the other excuses for stagnation and death. It's just the cost of love, nothing more. Instead of love being death itself, he's trying to draw love from death. What happens from there, we'll have to wait and see. Canute's story is certainly what drew me into Vinland Saga, and seeing it for a second time, it settled as a very close runner-up to Psycho-Pass for my favorite anime, even taking over Black Lagoon. There's so many more details related to Canute's character that make it even more poignant, but they're kind of related to other characters, so I couldn't talk about them here, and it's mostly Thorfinn because he's one of the few other people to have experienced something that could be called love in this world, as Canute did with Ragnar. Thor's abandoned the exact life Thorfinn throws himself into. Despite having all the tools for success as Thor's true warrior, Thorfinn chooses to chase Askeladd across the north, hoping to one day get revenge. This is so detached from its original reality that Canute presides over their duel without even knowing the reason for it. So of course the prince wants to change the world. He witnesses Thorfinn getting the shit beat out of him again and again, and as far as he knows, it's completely pointless. And even with Thorfinn's reasoning, it still is pointless. And in the end, the one who didn't seek revenge gets it instead, as Canute kills Askeladd, who killed both his true and biological father alike. These two boys are paired so perfectly together because they're two sides of the same coin. One set up for failure who succeeds, and one for success who fails. I could go on for hours about their parallels, but I've already rambled here today, and I could probably and should probably make a whole video on Thorfinn to cover that, because it gets into a lot about his character instead of just Canute. So let me know if that's something you'd want to see. Now, I'm going to keep this intro brief because today is cursed and everything keeps breaking, so I keep having to try to re-record this, and I'm worried if I go any longer it's going to break again and I'll have to redo it all again. So I'll just say there's some important links in the description, most importantly my Patreon, where you could support me to help get better equipment that won't crash a lot. And you can be like these lovely people getting their name at the end of videos. But anyway, the subscribe thing and another video on screen, probably about Vinland Saga as well, so check those out if you want, subscribe if you want, and I'll just leave you by saying thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you again soon.